4 things I want to do before I give you the 2 arguments from side proposition. First, what do glorification in the common ground looks like? We think that it looks like things like posters or political monuments and memorials that are specifically built in order to contribute to the soldiers and kind of like portray them as this image of heroes. But second, by contrast, what do we support? We think that we're going to demonize war and their outcomes. So we think that, and at the same time, we're going to push forward and glorify things like peace advocates such as Martin Luther King or Gandhi. We think that ultimately, by demonizing war and the effects that war has caused, we will reach the point where we're more likely going to oppose whatever harm that is going to be introduced by the harms of glorifying war. But third, why will this demonization occur, right? Because we think that by pushing forth peace advocates like Martin Luther King and Gandhi, we think that generally citizens will have the consensus that war is something that is not going to be something that is preferable to happen, and we think that ultimately people will start glorifying war and people will actively contribute in it. But fourth, why will heinous act be directly related to the soldiers who are deemed as more like heroes and like sacrificial? This is because we think that more collateral damage in war means that you are more likely going to contribute yourself to the country more, right? So we think that ultimately the people who are awarded most in one's country and in a perspective, those are the people who committed the most war crimes or who have sacrificed themselves for the sake of the country more. So we think that by demonizing the people who are the most, who are glorified as heroes the most, we're directly demonizing the people who have committed the most heinous act and most sacrificial behavior in the common world. 2 arguments then. First, we think that glorification justifies action towards unnecessary war. The thesis of this argument is that we think that countries are more likely to have war, and in terms of ongoing war, the effects to this glorification will harm the ongoing war more. 3 reasons. A, we think that it is easier for there to be propaganda to brainwash citizens by the nation. For example, Japanese government in World War II, that is how they recruited the soldiers, and it is very easy for the government to guide because on the ground, soldiers will think that they're backed up by the countries and they usually listen to command, right? So therefore, we think that by the government brainwashing these people and by the consensus of like glorification, people are more likely going to enlist in the military. B, it is also easier to recruit because government have the resources, and especially when it comes to people from underprivileged communities or younger generation, they have this general like lean to want to enlist in the military if they're able to get the benefit. Because such as like a good package deal when it comes to universities or being enlisted in the military, or also being like the common consensus of being patriotic and being proud about being patriotic is connected with the reputation and status of being an ex-soldier or current military official. So we think that in general, by these measures and by these resources that governments are able to provide to you, that is how people generally get brainwashed and people have this positive attitude towards wanting to be enlisted in the military and wanting to see ex-soldiers as something that is extremely like high status. But C, we think that it is extremely like dangerous when it comes to these situations because soldiers are more likely going to commit into self-sacrificial behaviors from this kind of glorification. For example, like kamikaze or landmines and chemical attacks are usually they're enforced in the military because people are willing to do so, and people are brainwashed by the country to think that because they participate in those behaviors, they're heroic figures and there are people who are worthy to be glorified and there are people who are worthy to be supported by the citizens. We think that the outcome is extremely disproportionate when it comes to the harm that is provided onto these soldiers. Because by contrast, right, if you have demonization, state is going to be more sensitive because when it comes to de-escalation, states are going to take more measures in order to de-escalate political situations, such as the IRN in the UK when it comes to Palestine and Israel. They're going to have more diplomatic fights instead of backing up the military. Why is this true, right? Because we think that generally when they have a large military background and when they have a large amount of people enlisted in the military, we think that it makes it more likely for the soldiers to, it makes it more likely for the countries to have the ability to attack another country. But B, we also think that by switching and by like demonizing this like soldiers being heroic figures, we think that the use of drones other than humans and use of technologies will be more likely preferred on our side of the debate, because there will be better outcome for the citizens and humanitarian rights in general. But we think that by using drones, we're not going to escalate the situation of having common warfare, because first, drones are more measurable measures and outcomes because you know how much drones that you have dispatched. But second, governments have to specifically be taken out of drones, out of their military bans, because such as like Obama having to directly justify drone attacks. We think that by military enlistment and dispatchment, this is something that countries can fund or indirectly do that does not need them to have the direct justification. Second argument then, why we think glorification is an obstacle for post-war society. The thesis of this is that by glorification happening, we think that it is less likely for the countries to admit to war crimes. So this argument comes in two folds. A, we think that usually when it comes to war, there are a lot of heinous acts being committed, such as like rape or crime against humanity or ethnic cleansing. We think that families will still continue to exist, and by the glorification of these heroes, it becomes an insult for the families. So two outcomes will happen. A, there will be foreign affairs, so less likely for war crimes and citizens to still feed into the narrative once we demonize it. But B, internally, we think that ultimately it becomes a harm for the families to having to like continuously see soldiers that cause them harm to be continuously glorified. But we think the soldiers are prosecuted and executed on our side of the debate, such as like the Japanese Tokyo trial or the German trial. For example, like over 20 of the soldiers were directly prosecuted. We think that people want to have further explanations and demonize the situations further. But B, the second fold of this argument is that First World War usually are the ones who glorify their soldiers most. Why is this happening? Because usually for first world countries, they're the largest amount of soldiers to be dispatched and to be come back, rather than compared to like third world countries where the military backings are not as strong. So we think that there are larger sacrifices that makes it less likely we think that there are larger sacrifices that is committed in first world countries that makes glorification more likely to happen, and we think that this ultimately justifies the war escalation and imperialistic incentives that comes behind first world country, and because of that, proud to propose.
Offer POIs. I'll take every single POI you offer. Please offer a lot of POIs. The glorification of soldiers is the glorification of terror, violence, and war. It is an offense to victims, it is a justification for death, and it is an insult to humanity. On proposition, we stand for peace. My speech is going to be very, very simple. I'll be explaining what glorification is, then defending our two argumentation. But before that, the most important part of my speech, and basically the only thing that you really have to listen to in my speech, we're willing to concede to the entirety of opposition. We're willing to say that maybe soldiers' lives are a little bit worse in our world. Maybe we offer less protections and less help for soldiers in the after plan. However, we believe that by making the lives of soldiers worse, it de-incentivizes war. It de-incentivizes joining as a soldier. It de-incentivizes the humanitarian cost that war has. Making the soldier's life worse is our fundamental way to de-incentivize war in the first place. We're willing to concede to the entirety of opposition. We still think that war has larger harms to the most vulnerable individuals. We really don't care too much about the lives of soldiers afterwards. Before moving to argumentation or defending argumentation, on clarification then. Is the glorification of soldiers the glorification of war? We say yes, and the fundamental reason why is because those two things come in tandem. If we say that kamikaze pilots and their self-sacrifice is really cool, that is really heroic, etc., then we are also at the same time glorifying and justifying the concept of kamikaze pilots in the first place. We think that that is a humanitarian offense. The victims that creates is a humanitarian offense, and we are willing to say that we oppose all of that as well. The comparative in our world then is a world in which we don't say, look at how self-sacrifice of kamikaze pilots is so cool, so heroic, so etc. What we're going to say is we're going to do things like, look at what the kamikaze pilots did. Look at the millions of people that these pilots killed. Look at the fact that that plane crashing into a person's home killed their child, the mother, and the father. We're going to say that is a negative thing that occurs in the world, and we're going to significantly demonize the concept of soldiers doing that, and therefore the implication that has on the war. On the comparative then, what we stand for towards things like the glorification of peace advocates, individuals who can stand up to the war and say, look, that is a negative thing that occurs in society, we don't think that that should happen, and that we are going to say, even the soldiers who are not willingly committing these acts, that all of those individuals should be demonized. We see that peace advocation leads to the demonization of war. Now defending our case then. The single line response and the silver bullet from opposition that comes is everyone hates war, therefore war likely won't happen unless it has to. I don't think this is fundamentally true. There are many state incentives to do and glorify war. This looks like seeming like you're taking a hard stance against terrorists, like what happened after 9/11. It looks like taking very strategically good areas in the world, like what the US does. It looks like why the US did the invasion on Afghanistan and the military intervention in Afghanistan in the first place. We think that there exists state incentive to do war. I don't think that the claim that war is a last measure can stand in this debate. There is massive incentive for states to do war if they can. This leads directly into the first argumentation. We tell you that by glorifying soldiers, and therefore in tandem glorifying the war, it leads to the easier justification of unnecessary forms of war, whether it is increased war, so more state opt-in, or whether it is the increased scale and mass destruction that occurs as a result of war. We give you 3 reasons from Ayaka's speech as to why this is the case. Number 1, we tell you that it leads to the dissemination of state propaganda that can glorify war and therefore lead to opt-in. This leads into the second mechanism, that it leads to easier conscription and recruitment from the state's end. That but in our world, by demonizing the concept of becoming a soldier in the first place, and therefore portraying the negative implications of becoming a soldier, you could lose a limb, you could not get any healthier in the future, your life could suck. Exactly the mechanism opposition gives you. That leads to less people opting into war, which leads to less state capacity in fighting war. And thirdly, the opposition side compels self-sacrifice. That it looks like kamikaze pilots. It looks like if people aren't willing to do this kind of self-sacrifice, it leads to not happening. The conclusion is that the glorification of soldiers is the empowerment of the state and the military. It gives capacity for the military to do things like change state policy to benefit the military. It looks like increased control over the soldiers that they have, and it looks like increased monetary and military capacity for them to create unnecessary mass force forms of war. We give you a comparative here. We tell you that by spreading the message of peace, by demonizing war and the concept of becoming a soldier in the first place, it leads to less opt-in, it leads to less propaganda, it leads to the weakening of the state and the military. That we think that prevents unnecessary form of war. The weighing metric here is very, very simple. That why, even assuming opposition best, which we're completely willing to do, why we think that we ought prioritize preventing war over preventing soldier harm. 3 reasons. Number 1, on extent of harm, because we think that victims face a lot more, or the result of war is much larger than the result that it has on soldiers. That we think that war is the premise for soldiers existing in the first place. If we can prevent war, we can prevent any harm that occurs to soldiers on opposition. Number 2, on reversibility, because war is an irreversible harm. At worst, we can still increase healthcare benefits for soldiers after the plan. And number 3, on the vulnerability of harm that occurs. Because war has harm on innocent civilians. Soldiers, at the very least, are doing things like opting in or choosing to do specific things. We think that therefore, the vulnerability of these individuals is massively different, especially because it looks like individuals, give me a second, it also looks like, especially because things like victims likely don't have guns to fight against them. Sure, go ahead.
To what extent this kind of glorification affect this kind of war, so that this kind of glorification worsen the war?
2 things. Number 1, I don't think it really matters. We don't have to prove to you that the extent is very massive. At the very least, we get some weakening of war, we get some lessening of war. That is a much larger benefit than any arbitrary argumentation that you can bring. I think number 2, the demonization of soldiers is massive, and the reason for this is your entire argumentation. You tell us that the glorification is massively coercive and can lead to massive benefits for soldiers. That same mechanism has to apply to our side. If you want to glorify soldiers and that leads to end outcomes, then us glorifying peace advocates likely leads to the similarly massive outcomes that I think you make the case for us. Regarding our second argumentation then, there was no response from opposition. We give you a case on the reconstruction of post-conflict states and how internal and external demonization has to happen for proper catharsis of the war to happen. We need to move on. The fundamental fact is that the glorification of the acts of soldiers and the glorification of war is an offense to human rights, to human dignity, and to victims. When we don't do this demonization that is necessary for individuals to move on, it leads to the post-conflict state being harmed in the capacity capacity, in their capacity to reconstruct, their deputy has to engage to this argumentation. I think that this also is an independent path to victory. For all those reasons then, for peace, propose.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep, all there.
Okay. Okay, 3, 2, 1. I will answer 2 questions in this debate. First of all, which narrative reduces the possibility of war or unnecessary war? Secondly, how can we rebuild post-war society, post-conflict society? So the first question, which narrative reduces the possibility of war? 4 levels of rebuttals to the other side of the house. First of all, entire case from the other side of the house is about peace is rare. We need to have a perception that peace is rare. Therefore, we need to educate people about the reality of warfare. We agree, but that's different from glorification of war. We are more than happy to support things like showing full horror of war. We think showing grotesque imagery or realistic imagery of warfare is necessary for us, but that's different from value judgment of glorification of war. We think showing that reality is necessary for us to discouragement. Therefore, that argument rather supports the ways in which we want to sensitize citizens about the reality of warfare. On the second level, the opposition never addressed the issue of who abuses this rhetoric. Like, because soldiers pay ultimate cost of death, we enjoy this peace right now. That's the rhetoric coming from the other side of the house. But who is likely to abuse this rhetoric? We believe military generals, security apparatus, right-wing conservative politicians, or military-industrial complexes like Halliburton are likely to abuse this rhetoric for increasing military spending or escalate ongoing war or wage the next war. We already observe in many situations the country engaged with the territorial disputes such as China and Russia. Therefore, this intuitively appealing rhetoric will rather desensitize public to question the legitimacy of warfare. This is exactly why our Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister explained we have absolutely no response from the other side of the house. Number 3, I will take it later. Number 3, about the veteran, the retired military veteran. That's a totally different debate. We already see like these retired military veterans are already super privileged in the status quo. They have access to wealthy pension scheme or healthcare scheme, which is different from the general public. Therefore, budget is currently too much spent to take care of this retired veteran. We are not saying that we should forget these people, but we need balanced discourse is necessary. Number 4, their approach is that the most heinous war criminals are not praised in a post-conflict society. No, the person who made the most contribution is likely to be considered as a hero in post-conflict society. For example, Nelson Mandela in South Africa was considered as a terrorist by the international community, by UK and United States. However, the Nelson Mandela was considered as a freedom fighter in South Africa. Therefore, interpretation of a heinous war criminal and a hero is very subjective, which is up to public interpretation. Therefore, I think their characterization from the other side of the house is very questionable. I will take point of information from you. Go ahead.
You talk about Nelson Mandela, but also at times where racism was very prevalent and okay, but nowadays it's not prevalent, especially in developing countries, as Ayaka said.
Oh, you need to have more logics to run what you have just explained. I hope the weak speaker will fundamentally substantiate that point. I will further address that point in my second argument, if possible. So moving on to the second question, how can we rebuild post-conflict society? 2 things here. First of all, our counterfactual demonization of soldier is necessary for rebuilding peace. They misunderstand the example of Japan. Japan successfully demonized soldiers, all the soldiers. After World War II and the Pacific War, the International Tribunal for the Far East, which was called Tokyo Trial, was held 1945. And all the soldiers, many soldiers were prosecuted, not just war criminals, but many general soldiers were prosecuted and punished. And because the General MacArthur and the GHQ thought that it was necessary to create an overwhelmingly negative perception towards soldiers in general, and we needed to hold these soldiers responsible for crimes and war rather than portraying soldiers as victims. This was the main strategy for GHQ when they governed Japan. Why was that necessary? Because it was necessary to stop remilitarization of Japan. In order to stop remilitarization of Japan and in order to stop the rise of right-wing nationalists, GHQ needed to portray all the soldiers as overwhelmingly responsible for war itself. And because of that policy, the new constitution was built based on that overwhelmingly negative narratives for soldiers. And because of that, Article 9, peaceism, was included in the new constitution of Japan. As a result, no ownership of force was accepted, except for minimum self-defense force. So Japan, in general, do not own any offensive force. That was the successful example of demonizing all the soldiers as a negative element rather than making them heroes. By contrast, what would happen on their side with us when we recognize these soldiers as a hero? So in post-conflict society, the dictator can utilize and abuse this rhetoric. Soldiers fought the war in order to bring about peace. Therefore, we need to continue to resort to this violent mechanism and avenue through which we can solve the problem. This has a negative impact on many African countries after independence. For example, in Côte d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, Laurent Gbagbo committed massacre. In Sudan, Darfur, Omar al-Bashir committed massacre and genocide. In Liberia, Richard Taylor committed massacre. All these dictators used the rhetoric that because our soldiers fought in the past, we have to continue to fight. And this rhetoric incentivizes security apparatus and military generals and even citizens to justify the war. And that's a negative outcome, members of this house. Why is that so harmful? Because even though we have alternative mechanisms such as diplomatic talk, concessions, negotiations, the public mindshare or mindshare of citizens are structurally preoccupied with the mindset that war is the mechanism. Fighting the war is legitimate and necessary and ideal ways in which we solve the problem. And that narrative is overly generalized by media outlets and politicians in elections. Therefore, all the other alternative methods are structurally deprioritized or even forgotten in the discourse in post-conflict society. Therefore, in post-conflict society, the heroism given by soldiers will exacerbate the stability and the possibility of rebuilding a peaceful transition to democracy. And that's the harm that we have observed in many African continents after independence. Therefore, so for all these reasons, we are happy to propose. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Wilfred. As a final substantive debate, I'd like to invite the opposition.
I think that glorification and showing the results of war is less likely going to happen and not mutually exclusive on their side. Because if you have relatives or friends who have directly killed a person, no matter them protecting or attacking a country, this perspective will make you deem the opponent as hateful and deserving. That is why we do prefer demonization and showing the impact of war, because it is much easier when you deem both sides, no matter they're protecting your country or attacking your country, as a villain to disencourage this behavior. We have told you two things in this debate, and I'll go through them. First on the practical and second on the principle. First on the practical. 3 reasons why we told you the glorification justifies unnecessary war. A, propaganda to brainwash citizens. B, resources to draft citizens. And C, dangerous self-sacrificial acts are going to be committed in this process. We prefer A, de-escalation of being more likely to happen, such as like losing military backings and citizens' attitude to go against war, but B, also introduction of technology such as drones to require more direct, which requires more direct action from governments, and they're more quantifiable measures. To which they mitigate by saying, right, everyone is already opposing war. To which we say that no, because funding war and military bodies and also occupations of land through military measures still happen very much so in the current world, right? But we also think that through glorification, soldiers who have still participated in heinous behaviors are going to be glorified on their side. Which brings me what they said about soldiers are merely protecting their country from attacks. But that does not make much sense if you really think about it, because if there are no attackers, who are they protecting countries from, right? They're very much still soldiers who attack another country. They're going to be soldiers who are attacking another country as equal to the soldiers who are protecting another country. But also, they have killed people nonetheless, right? We think that ultimately, we shouldn't glorify people even if they're protecting the country because they have broken humanitarian codes, right? We at least prevent retaliatory attacks on our side, even if we trade off all the benefits that we have said, and we say that, yeah, sure, like, they're protecting the country. But we think that the likelihood of war justification still is more prominent on their side, right? Because they're inherently unable to claim the de-escalation as long as they still have enlistments and large military backing. And even if Paul says that like Japanese people do not like war, glorification of heroes and monuments, their inability to recognize war crimes still makes Japan the largest military and a strong military in terms of the world. That is what reality is, and we think that this directly contributes to how much like countries are able to justify their behaviors when it comes to attacking another country. But they also tell you, as a practical, soldiers are going to be neglected on our side. Yeah, sure, if that would mean there is no war, if it means that military attacks are less likely going to happen, if they lack military enlistments, we think that we reach a more utilitarian world when it comes to like having a better world, right? And we would much rather for the countries to de-escalate and evacuate rather than warfare properly started by engagement. Second on the principle then, we tell you that post-war reconstruction are going to be harmed because first, diplomatic relations are going to be harmed, citizens are not going to admit to war crimes, and second, families of citizens victims are going to be harmed. But we also say the very first world imperialism are very likely to be justified, to which they respond with, oh no, developed countries have much more recognition, to which we think, yes, there's global recognition that happens on our world, but America still continuously participates in military tactics, but we also think that it is also ignorant to say that developing countries are much less likely to have this kind of recognition for war being bad, because they are the countries that have been damaged the most from the lack of military fundings, and they are who have most likely suffered from this imperialistic glorification, who has the most incentive to stop this war. Therefore, by proving that developed countries have the financial ability to sustain war, we think that we claim all the harms of principle to the damage of their behaviors and narratives when it comes to glorification against peace-seeking countries. They say war is necessary and we want to maintain war peace, but we think that this leads to the death of millions. Proud to propose.